The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Let's go back in the conversation to what you were talking about with everyone is going to have an account with the Fed. So unpack that and let's explore why that's a really, really big deal from a standpoint of bank reserves and, as Dr. Lacey Hunt would say, turning bank reserves into legal tender, and then also from a standpoint of Big Brother.
Right. So right now, we have to, whilst people can argue about what the mechanism is for how quantitative easing gets into the real economy or not, you don't need to have that argument if we all have a Fed account, because if the Fed can literally press a button and give me and you $1,000 or $100,000 or $1 million or whatever, and it appears there, and we can freely go and spend that on our phone, in a Starbucks, in a whatever, and it works. As far as Starbucks is concerned, this is a US dollar.
Yeah.
Now, it's still fiat money. There's nothing kind of super clever about it, really. And for those that like blockchain, they'll be saying, well, this won't be decentralized. And no, it won't. It will be a database held by the government. Mm-hmm. And if you do something bad and they decide they're going to change your entry, you will suddenly have less money.
In a database where they see every single transaction.
Correct. And they control it. Yeah. Yep. So now some people say, well, that's great because that means the Fed can directly put money into people's bank accounts. Now, if we go down the Dr. Hunt kind of angle, I think most people get that politicians are generally not going to be people that say no to spending more, just seemingly how the world, I mean, that was different 20 years ago. I remember these debates, but, and so are they going to press that button or not? Of course they will. And so, one can see how there's a nice argument, if all that happens, for having some significant inflation of the money supply and prices, and however you want to look at it, to have inflation.
Yeah. How do you think velocity plays into that? Because in my mind, if they have control, that much control, then they could say you got to spend the money within 30 days or it's gone.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's the little cherry on top, right? I mean, they could. Here's $10,000. You must spend it in 30 days, else it literally goes away. Oh, by the way, if that doesn't work, spend it in 10 days. If it doesn't work, spend it in 10 hours. Oh, we actually want you to spend more money. We want to help the retail sector because JCPenney's shut down and whatever. Well, you know what? You have to spend it in JCPenney. This can all be done because what you've really done is you've made money non-fungible. So a dollar bill is a dollar bill is a dollar bill. You can use it wherever. But actually, if the dollar bill basically has code on it that says, well, you can only use it here, then you've made money non-fungible. I don't think we have any clue what ramifications that will have in the long run, because that's never been tried before.
Boy, yeah, that's a great point. And talk about a misallocation of resources. If the government,
sure. I mean, yeah, you get, in effect, bureaucrats and governments deciding that one can argue now that probably the most convincing argument why we're in, there's a lot of deflationary pressures right now is the misallocation of capital, because nothing's allowed to go bust. And many people say capitalism is dead, and which is sad because, America's, and maybe even most acutely in America, which is really sad considering it's been one of the, engines of innovation of the world for the last 100 years or more. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's, I see that potentially affecting the supply side, but affecting the demand side as far as the direction that the demand is placed. I mean, I think through like a social score, like we've heard talk about in China, and how if the Fed, I mean, taking it another step, I'm just thinking out loud, if we all had accounts with the Fed and they were competing with the commercial banking system for lending, then you could get a car loan or a home loan, as an example, directly from the Fed, in which case because they can take an unlimited haircut on those loans because they're not really hampered by profit and loss like the commercial banking system. So they wouldn't have to necessarily give loans based on credit score or give loans based on the probability of the individual paying them back. They could make it almost exclusively on a social credit score.
Right, but of course that might be the thing that tips the balance. So this does exist in China now, and it can decide whether you're allowed, ignoring COVID, which is obviously, change things for the short term, medium term, but it can decide whether you're allowed to travel somewhere or not. Okay, well, is a 26-year-old going to be very happy if they're told they can't travel somewhere because of this score or whatever it is? Now, they might be happy with the fact they're getting money, but then suddenly their freedoms have gone. I mean, the problem is I don't have much confidence that the politicians can navigate this delicate balance in an entirely new area that is gigantic. I mean, we can't even know if a recession's coming. I mean, how many economists predict recessions? The answer is almost none. Yeah. We live in such a ridiculously complex, interconnected world. Are politicians going to get this just right and get, all the knobs they can turn either way? Are they going to? I don't think so. But again, ultimately, that's why democracy is important. We solve at the ballot box. It may take a long time. So.
Yeah, it's a great point. We're dealing with a complex system with the economy, and I always look at it. It's very much like nature. You always hear those stories about, like in Florida or something, when there's too many insects, they bring in the frogs, and the next thing you know, the frog problem's like 10 times bigger. Then they bring in alligators to the frogs, and the alligator problem's even bigger than the frog problem. And I think it's the exact same thing with the economy, or anytime a politician tries to kind of micromanage that and turn that dial, you're always going to get those unintended consequences.
And this is like an unpopular view I have, but some people like it, some others don't, which is that this is all because we have very short political cycles. So one could argue in the US it's a 2-year cycle just because of how the Senate and the House. And that does change things. So you could argue it's a 2 or 4 year cycle. Doesn't really matter. It's still a short period of time. The UK has a 5-year cycle. Most of Europe, most of the world is between 3 to 5 year political cycles. Of course, there are exceptions to this, whether it be China and other countries. But I'm not suggesting everyone should have longer cycles, because I'm a firm believer in having that kind of check on democracy every few years. But it does mean it's incredibly hard to plan for the future in the long run. Everything's become so partisan and of the moment that things like retirement age and things that do require 30 years thinking ahead get very swept under the carpet. And that's another giant problem that is being talked about a lot less this year. But the problem hasn't gone away. So.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about that, Singapore is the first place that comes to mind, and that it can work if you got the right guy or gal in charge. It can work. That the problem is when you're centralizing that much power, eventually you're going to get the wrong guy or gal potentially, and then you got real problems.
And also
centralized.
And also Singapore, I love Singapore, but it's 7 million people, very similar to Hong Kong. It's small geographically. Yep. It just compared to the complexity of, say, just the US, or indeed you could argue Europe as an amalgamation of a federation of countries. What works in a country of 5 to 10 million could be a Sweden or whatever, right? Or New Zealand. It doesn't necessarily work in the US or China or India. As you have literally 2 magnitudes difference in population levels, it's not so easy.